Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a delicious lunch. Huge shout out to the Fredericton Inn for the lunch we ate in studio here in Fredericton. So if you're just joining us this afternoon, it would be time to remind you of a few things. So this is a bilingual event, and you can watch the presentations in the language of your choice. You can also ask questions to all our presenters today by using the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen. All presentations are being recorded and will be available on demand until noon Wednesday, October 27th. Our next presenter is Elizabeth Dubé. Elizabeth spoke this morning as part of our myth-busting panel discussion. In case you missed this discussion this morning, Elizabeth is our Executive Director of Sourcing with Strategic Procurement. Elizabeth's team is responsible for procuring goods and services on behalf of departments and school districts. The team is also responsible for procuring construction services on behalf of the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure for departments, schools, and regional health authorities. Elizabeth's now here to talk about responding to RFPs or request for proposals, and she'll be offering some tips and tricks for supplier success. Elizabeth, welcome back, and over to you.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm very, very excited to be here today. As Nicole mentioned, my session today will be around responding to an RFP, hopefully giving you some tips and tricks to increase your success with RFP responses. So let's begin. So the objectives, sorry, let me go back. Let's begin. So the objectives for today's session is to assist you in developing a better understanding of, first, what is a request for proposal, so what we call an RFP, the structure of an RFP, so what does that look like, and then, of course, the evaluation of the bids against that RFP, and then the post-evaluation activities and what goes on behind the scenes after that. So let's move right along into what is an RFP. So as the screen suggests, an RFP solicits proposals through a competitive bidding process by an entity. So in this case, government, when they're interested in procuring goods or services in accordance with applicable legislation and trade agreements. An RFP is more commonly used for goods or services where the evaluation is based on more factors than price alone. So we're looking at qualitative measures in the evaluation. It allows for the evaluation of even more qualitative criteria than a technical specification, and it would need to align with the complexity of goods or services being procured. So let's dive a bit into what types of RFPs there are. The first one that I'll illustrate is around contract AB. And for those of you who have been responding to RFPs for some time, this would be the first, the legacy, if you will, type of RFP that has been on the market. It is considered legally binding by both parties. So both the issuing entity as well as the supplier has a legal obligation to both tender and response. There's little to no flexibility in the requirements, and there's no opportunity to refine both the solicitation or the response to that solicitation. The next one is what we consider a BAFO, or concurrent negotiation style RFP. We call a BAFO a best and final offer RFP method. And so in contrast to the contract AB, it is not legally binding. It does require or enable a short list of qualified proponents. It allows for the opportunity to refine your requirements. So as an issuing entity, I could publish a second iteration of an RFP to refine what I put out initially as my requirements. It also allows a supplier to refine their responses in relation to the refinements that we make in the issuing notice. There is an opportunity for open dialogue during concurrent negotiations, and this is an exciting addition to the procurement experience. So this allows for both the issuing entity and the suppliers to actually get in a room and talk. Imagine that. Talk about the RFP that went out, talk about the bid that was proposed, ask some questions to understand better, and then hopefully set both parties up for an even stronger end result. So shortlisted suppliers from the initial stage of the BAFO procurement would be required to submit a new response for evaluation after the concurrent negotiations. And from this, that final iteration, that final set of refinements in the document would be evaluated again, and the successful proponent would be selected from that activity. The next method is what we call in the industry a rank and run, or consecutive negotiation. And so with this one, it again is not legally binding. You can negotiate with the top ranked proponent, and it allows the opportunity to cease negotiations and move to the next highest scoring proponent if negotiations are unsuccessful. So I would just clarify a bit or explain a bit further that rank and runs and BAFOs are very similar in that they're both not legally binding. You would negotiate finally with the top ranked proponent, and you both have the ability to cease negotiations at any time. The difference with the rank and run is that you don't have the dialogue phase, and you don't generally have a refinement phase through the process. So these essentially are the three types of RFP methods or styles that we use. Let's talk a little bit about the legislation, the boring part of the presentation. I'll try to make it exciting. The Procurement Act in New Brunswick is essentially the act and its relevant regulation that we must adhere to, and that would be Regulation 2014-93, whenever we are doing an RFP or any other procurement sourcing activity. The issuance of RFPs and the subsequent evaluation of submissions is regulated and managed by the Strategic Procurement Division in accordance with the Act. So who issues RFPs? You'll note that we've identified all four parts of government, and but for those of you who are not aware, part one would be departments and agencies, part two, school districts, so Anglophone, Francophone school districts, as well as schools. Part three would be the regional health authorities, so Vitality and Horizon, and then part four would be the Crown Corps, so for example, NB Power. To extrapolate a bit on this, the Strategic Procurement Division of Service New Brunswick is charged with issuing all tenders and RFPs on behalf of parts 1, 2, and 3, and that would be related to goods, services, and construction. All RFPs that are issued by Strategic Procurement for parts 1, 2, and 3 of government are advertised on the New Brunswick Opportunities Network, the NBON system. And if you took part in an earlier session today with our panel, we mentioned a lot about the NBON system. So if you are interested in doing business with us, get on the NBON system, get registered to be able to see those opportunities. Part 4 entities and municipalities, they also advertise on the NBON system, so you'll have access to that information as well. So let's talk a bit about RFP scoring criterias. So in addition to price, RFPs allow for the scoring and evaluation of multiple qualitative criteria, such as, but not limited to, you'll see I've identified a few, Proposed service delivery and methodology. So that's where we want to know, how do you deliver, or how will you deliver what you are proposing to us? Tell us your story. Tell us your methodology. Company background and experience. So you can imagine, when we engage to deliver on services for government, we need to know that companies who are providing these services for us, that they've done it before, they have experience, that they can deliver for us. Project resources, or the team, that's critical. So more importantly, I want to know that as a company, who are the people you will be handing to us in terms of delivering the service? Who are you entrusting that to? Do they have experience? So that segues into project team references. So you're telling me who they are. Now show me that they've done it before and that there's feedback to affirm that they've done it well. Company references. So some people get confused and they say, why do you ask for company references and team references? What's the difference? So company references is where we want to know that the company itself has held the risk and had the experience of executing on the same type of services in the past. So not just the people behind it, but the company as well, that you have owned that responsibility and delivered. Demonstrations and presentations. This is a fun part of the process. I enjoy it immensely. It's something we have started to do more of. This is where we invite proponents to come in and actually, if you will, bring their proposal to life. So take us a bit deeper through your proposal. Tell us more about what you've told us. It allows us to ask questions and get feedback. And then finally, technical requirements. So we may actually put an RFP out for goods where we need to know the specifics about a specific product, the intricacies of it, the mechanics of it, the quality of it. And so this list is not exclusive or exhaustive. There's actually even more criteria you could put into your RFP. But this is a common sample of the popular go-tos for evaluation criteria with government. So now let's look at the structure of an RFP. And so it doesn't matter if you look at an RFP from GNB, SNB, you look at it from another province. Public sector RFPs and even private sector tend to cover many of the same themes in their RFP. You may notice some nuances of change. You may notice some that don't have certain sections in it. But for the most part, these are common themes, common sections that you would find in an RFP. And so the first one's basic, the title page and the reference to the RFP number, the title, and then that very important factor of the closing date and the time, of course. General terms and conditions of the procurement process. So for government, this tends to be the legalese, right? This is where you really want to hone in on what we're saying in terms of any legally binding information or areas that might be potential for negotiation. A lot of the information that exists in the general terms and conditions also will form part of the contract in the future. Instructions for responding to the RFP. So very, very important. You need to read this section comprehensively and clearly. Instructions for submitting questions. So this gets often overlooked. We want you to raise questions if something is not clear. This is another common section. Information on the procuring entity. So we want you to find a little bit more about who is issuing this? Who is the department that is engaging you to provide a service? The scope of the procurement. So you hear people use the term scope pretty loosely in the RFP world. Scope is, what are we buying? What do we want? What problem are we trying to solve? What will I have to do as a proponent if I sign a contract? That's scope. The technical requirements and the deliverables. So again, we're asking you, that goes along with scope. What is it that you will be required to do? What will I have to deliver on? So scope and technical requirements and deliverables are interchangeably used. And then finally, the evaluation criteria and associated weightings, so important. So if you're responding to an RFP, you want to look at this section to determine, where am I putting my focus on responding to this? What priority weight is being put on each of these sections? That should determine the kind of effort that you're putting in each of these sections. So now responding to an RFP. So what do I need to respond? And everyone feels, I think, I shouldn't say everyone, many suppliers feel there is a Morse code to be unlocked to learn how to respond to an RFP. That is not the case. In fact, I think just by adhering to some of these tips that I'm giving you, it can help position you to be able to respond. So first and foremost, and it may seem so simple, but I'm saying read the RFP carefully in its entirety, including any applicable attachments. That seems so simple, but we see so often that suppliers fail to read a document comprehensively and certain criteria are missed. So make sure you read it. The next thing is to submit questions to seek clarification. Do not assume. I use those words so often with suppliers. Do not assume. We cannot assume that you understand. We cannot assume that you interpreted it a certain way if you didn't tell us in your response. You have to ask your questions while that RFP is posted during the published period and before the closeout of question period, so that you can make sure your answer is comprehensive and clear. It will also avoid many difficult hills that could present in contract negotiations and often, avoid you from having to walk away from a procurement. So ask your questions. Adhere to all the proposal submission requirements. I think some suppliers who may not understand the full RFP process feel that an RFP has some areas of gray where they don't have to meet requirements. And in some cases, you will see us score and not identify as a mandatory some of these requirements. If we are asking you to do something in an RFP, we are also asking you to adhere to those submission requirements. So please listen and please interpret it as a requirement. And then finally, failure to meet a mandatory requirement. And so those common affirmative words of will, must, and shall will result in the disqualification of a proposal. So proponents often think that we can change requirements if they have missed something, and it may seem very minor or minute. Unfortunately, we cannot change that after the RFP or tender closes. So please remember to watch for those. And then to expound further, make note of any preference statements within requirements to obtain the best possible results. So this particular one is an example that is about the New Brunswick First procurement policy. And this one enables GNB entities in parts 1, 2, and 3 to apply a preference to New Brunswick suppliers when the estimated value of the procurement is below the lowest applicable trade agreement threshold. So when it is a low dollar value procurement, we do have the ability to apply that preference. So look for that. It could be that we have a statement that says higher points will be given to proponents demonstrating X. Adhere to that, pay attention. Put enough detail into your answers as though you're explaining your response to someone who is not familiar with the procurement. Even if you are a supplier who has done business with us for years in various capacities, don't assume we know your story because you've provided a service for us for so long. This happens a lot. Vendors who not through their fault. It's just natural to assume that we've done business with them for a long time. They would know the answer to that. I'll only keep it maybe to a few brief bullet points, and I'll leave some things out. If we've asked for the answer to be robust, comprehensive, please do that. Please don't assume. So, some extra tips. I'd like you to monitor email and NBON for any amendment notifications. So this is something that some suppliers forget to do. They'll submit their proposal and then feel confident that the journey is done. Now I wait. You need to still watch for email notifications because that RFP or tender may get amended as a result of questions you submit. So please make sure to watch that. We wouldn't want you to forget a very important revision or amendment that could alter the result of your proposal. And you'll see how I've added for extra flavor just to get my point across again. Don't assume. Ask your questions prior to the question period deadline. So often RFPs will say questions will be responded to up to a certain date. So generally speaking, you need to get your questions in by then. Give yourself enough time to be able to answer those questions early. Typically, we close question period out about a week before the tender closes or the RFP. And I use the words tender RFP interchangeably because an RFP is a tender. We're saying that you should follow formatting instructions and proofread your submissions. So you would be quite surprised how many errors and omissions or just general grammatics, poor spelling that we see in proposals. And it makes sense to me when people are rushed trying to cram as much information into the time frame they have that these things get overlooked. But I would remind you that the final thing you should do before you submit your proposal, and we humbly ask you to do this because it does make our lives easier, please proofread and review your proposal. The proposal will be evaluated exclusively on its content, and I alluded to that before as well. So everything will be evaluated on what you put into the proposal. We can't assume. So again, if you've done business with us, make sure that even though we've done that, you've included your full story in the proposal. Ensure receipt of bid submission prior to closing at the location indicated. So oftentimes people will click send on their emailed bid, their electronic bid, or they'll submit it through NBON and they won't check to see, did I get a receipt? Did it actually get sent? Did my actual email go through? So check your sent box to make sure that it did go through, and make sure that it's at the date and time before the date and time indicated. So often with goods and services type procurements, for part 1 and 2, they close often at 1:30, for example. It's not 1:30:02, it's 1:30:00. And so if you are beyond that by even a fraction of a second, you will be considered disqualified. And it pains us to disqualify a bid for something as simple as that. The legislation is very explicit around what we have to do in those cases. And so I really, really plead you to make sure that you're getting it in on time. Give yourself lots of time. And then the final one in red and bold, and you're probably thinking, okay, really? Sign the submission. This gets forgotten more often than you can imagine, and it's painful to see this. Vendors who are putting huge amount of time and resources, and that's money, right? Time and resources into these very elaborate proposals only to not sign it. And I've had suppliers ask me to accept the proposal regardless, and we can't. The legislation, again, is very clear on that. So please, please sign the submission. I guarantee if you talk to a supplier who has done this, they will tell you that they didn't forget it again. So now let's talk about the evaluation methods. So we've given you some tips on things you need to do as you approach your responses. So now how do we evaluate you? So there's two main evaluation methods which are utilized by strategic procurement. We have a single stage or a multi-stage. And so the standard method utilized by strategic procurement is the multi-stage RFP. So we'll first look at the multi-stage RFP. And so this method can be made up of any variation of the following, whereby each category represents its own distinct stage. So you'll notice that I use some of these same categories when I talked about the different evaluation criteria earlier. So you see technical, demonstration, presentation, proof of concept, references, and price. So when we talk about a multi-stage, it often means that there would be an elimination round at each stage or juncture. So what we essentially are trying to do is to get as many proponents who are technically qualified at the end of all of the multi-stages. And this often could be based on highest score, and generally is out of 100. So it could be that at the technical stage, we have a minimum score requirement in order to move on to the next stage. And so oftentimes than not, you'll see a multi-stage used, especially if you do have a presentation phase where we're shortlisting how many proponents would come in to do a presentation. The next one is around a single stage RFP. And so very similar to multi-stage, the same criteria you will see. The only thing is that in this format, price is included in the weighted scored criteria only out of a full 100 points, not often with distinct elimination rounds, but you will see sometimes minimum score requirements for certain aspects of criteria in the categories. The supplier with the lowest proposed price gets the maximum amount of available points as identified in the evaluation criteria of the RFP. The supplier with the highest total cumulative points is considered to be the successful proponent. So we often get questions around how price is evaluated. And so it's important to remember that all of the bids received in terms of pricing, they're all evaluated in relation to whatever the lowest bid we received was. And there is a formula that we do supply in order to be able to arrive at those points. So if I have the lowest bid, I will get the full allotment of points for that particular section. So evaluation of bids just extrapolated a bit further. And so there's a lot of good information on this screen. What you see is a sample technical evaluation grid. This is commonly put in an RFP that we issue. You'll see that on the left, the criterion section, that's mapped to all of the requirements that we've asked for in the RFP. And then of course, the weight that we're assigning to each of those criteria. And then if there's a minimum score. So in this case, if we could focus on project team, you'll see that project team has 40 points, and we said that a minimum score required is 28 points. So I know that 40 points out of 100, there's a fair bit of weight being put on this section. First of all, I need to put a lot of effort behind this section, but I also have to get at least 28 points on this. So if I get 27, I'm kicked out. And then I wouldn't proceed to being evaluated in the next section. So I really want to focus my attention on making sure that I'm completing all of these sections, but especially ensuring those minimum score required criterion are being met. So just if I take a random glance at this, you can see there's two sections, project team as well as methodology and implementation, that are both worth 40 points each. So that would tell me that I need to focus a large part and the majority of my attention on those two particular sections. And so this is probably also a good place to mention that when suppliers approach RFP submissions, they often will break it down so that different people are tackling different sections. You may not always have the same person responding to the full RFP. So I would draw your attention to the fact that even if you have somebody focusing on a 40-point section, it's very, very critical that that section also can connect with the other sections, and that comprehensively you are meeting all of the requirements of the RFP. So basically, you'll see at the bottom that everyone in this case is being scored out of total 100 points, and you have to achieve a minimum of 70 points. So I know that in responding to this RFP, I am looking at 5 categories of requirements. I have 2 categories that have a minimum score required of 28 points each. And I know that at the end of the whole process, I have to get at least 70 points overall. So that, in essence, should frame up how you approach your response. I always recommend to suppliers, go after you've read your requirements, after you've read the scope, go to your evaluation matrix and see how we're guiding you to respond to this in terms of the weight that we're putting behind each one. So evaluation committees. So after we get your proposals, after the grid has been established before we close the tender and we get your bids and we begin to evaluate, a very critical part of this process is the evaluation committee. So who would evaluate the bids? An evaluation committee that is made up of departmental representatives, subject matter experts, and stakeholders from the department. So we get asked often, does strategic procurement evaluate proposals? So for a departmental RFP that is not owned by Strategic Procurement Service New-Brunswick, so it's not us issuing the procurement for strategic procurement, we do not bid. If we were putting an RFP, we do not bid, we do not evaluate. If we actually issued an RFP as a client in need of a service or a good, then we could evaluate. Outside of that, we are there essentially to moderate and manage the procurement process. It's often led by a category specialist from my division. The specialist has to ensure that they adhere to the Act and the trade agreements and all of the policy guidance so that we can provide and ensure an open, fair, transparent process. So following the completion of the evaluation process and internal approvals, the service agreement is negotiated and signed, and then the contract's awarded. Once a purchase order has been issued, it can be viewed in NBON by clients. The time between the RFP closure and contract award varies due to many factors, including but not limited to approval timeframes, resource availability, and contract negotiations. And I would just highlight that for a minute. So, you know, often we're asked, when will this be awarded? When will there be a decision made? And I would say that we strive in every way possible to reduce our cycle time, but some things are beyond our control. But we do not have an issue with you reaching out to us and asking us if we have an anticipated end date for a response. In terms of the contract negotiations, if you have been involved in these in the past, you will know that some contract negotiations can go very quickly, and sometimes they can take a great deal of time depending upon how complex or how much legal content is often included in it, and how many areas there are for negotiation. So just some perspective on what you can expect with timelines. We would strive to get it as soon as possible, but sometimes things do delay. Supplier debrief. So I mentioned that earlier in my panel discussion. So once we issue the PO to the successful proponent, unsuccessful proponents may request a debrief. Some suppliers are not even aware that this service is available, but this process is intended to provide constructive feedback in order to learn for possible future procurement submissions. So it's a way for you to improve, and it's a safe place for us to have dialogue around any errors, omissions, or areas for improvement. And a lot of suppliers choose not to request a debrief, but many do request one. And in those cases, I have seen many success stories result from having those debriefs. And so I would also remind successful proponents that even if you've been awarded a contract, depending upon how high your score was, maybe there still are areas for you to improve. So it's good for you to also ask for a debrief. And finally, just some closing comments. So I would encourage you to visit the NBON to access our tenders and RFPs. You need to get out there. And if you're not familiar with the process and you find it daunting, reach out to us. We have a fabulous team of people on our help desk, at my office, Nicole's group. We have a lot of resources. So please reach out to us. Again, and I mentioned this before, it does not require special training or experience to be successful in proposal drafting. Sometimes you do need a little extra help, and that's okay too. But we would remind you that in general, read the RFP carefully and ensure your answers are very clear to the requirements we've proposed. Make sure you sign your bid and get it submitted on time. Never be afraid to ask questions. There is no penalty. We have a duty of fairness and transparency. Remember that I said, don't assume that we know your story. SNB and GNB encourages you to visit the NBON system for possible future opportunities. I hope this information has been useful for you today. I could talk and talk and talk about the RFP processes and all of the stories behind many of the situations we've lived in the RFP world. But this does conclude my portion of the teaching aspect of this presentation. I would welcome your questions. I'm here to answer them. I would challenge you to give me some questions that I can help increase and advance your RFP experience the next time that you approach proposal drafting.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for that super informative presentation on RFPs, or requests for proposals. I know every time I hear you talk about RFPs, I get excited and I learn more, so it's awesome. Thank you. So we do have some time for questions, and I know we have one that's already come in. So as a reminder, please use the chat to type your questions, and we will get to those. So question number one, Elizabeth, for you is, this looks like it's coming from, obviously, a supplier. We are a successful vendor for a couple of tenders under NBON, but we have departments asking for a variety of products listed in the tender. How do we know what we should carry to support the active tender?
Thank you, Nicole. So essentially, and I'd have to know the background behind where this is coming from, but essentially we do put tenders out, and I mentioned this earlier today as well. Some tenders are put out explicitly with an ask of a specific type of product, and that could be from a risk perspective or a technical requirement that we have to use that product. But then in general, and more often than not, we put an equivalency requirement in the tender, which allows you the flexibility of proposing other products. So some people think there have to be certain and only certain types of products that we will look at when we put that equivalency in. I would say to pay close attention to what we say. If we say brand X or equivalent, and we give you that list of specified requirements, we want you to essentially take your product and map it to those specific requirements to ensure that your product meets. You need to demonstrate that for us. So rather than focus on what products, what brands, what models you should be knowing to propose, it's more about mapping the products you have with the technical requirements of the product or equivalency factor that we've applied. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I guess I could ask to clarify with that question. I guess maybe I'm wondering if they are referring to an active tender. So they've already completed the tender process and they're maybe asking to get additional products on that list.
I see.
That could be just a different spin on that question, just
Yes.
in case that might be what they're looking for. Do you want to maybe speak to that?
Sure. Nope, that's great. So just to extrapolate on that, I also mentioned earlier that in some cases our contracts are considered more of a basket of goods, and we have the provision of adding more products to that contract. And so if that provision is in place, you can reach out to us at Service New-Brunswick, to strategic procurement staff, to engage on whether you can add a certain product or service to the basket of goods that's there. Oftentimes than not, if we've done a contract A/B type of procurement and it's a specified list of products that you proposed when you bid, that often will remain firm. But often we will add provisioning to add additional items, especially if there's an other category to certain contracts.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. So I'm going to ask a question that I have, since we're still waiting for some more great questions from the audience here. So we talked about at the beginning, Elizabeth, contract A/B RFPs and negotiate RFPs. So there's 2-3 different types of RFPs that you talked about. How would one of our clients choose what RFP they want to use when they're conducting a competitive process?
I love this question, Nicole. So I consider myself a procurement geek. So in this sense, this is something that we spend a lot of time talking to our clients on, especially if it's a very sensitive or unique type of procurement that's needed. So essentially, we go through a brainstorming exercise with our clients to discuss what are the requirements. In general, we used to always go to the general contract A/B type of procurement method, but now we have these 2 other types of methods that are more flexible in our toolkit. And so we'll often talk to the client about what they need and if they know what they need. So sometimes it's a larger thematic question, like a problem statement that they're trying to achieve a response for, and it's not cut and dry. They don't know if there are 5 solutions out there, if there are many vendors that could respond to this. Maybe they don't know what the requirements of that RFP should be. They're not aware of what this commodity is. Or there could be very many sensitive, critical layers to the procurement that is not just as simple as putting a list of requirements out and getting a response. So I would say that we use a contract A/B template format when we know what we want to buy, when we're certain of what those requirements are. So when the client has a lot of subject matter experience around it and the requirements are fairly confirmed, that's when often an A/B template or an A/B method is used. Now, the negotiated methods could be used, especially the rank and run, when you are aware of your technical requirements as well, but you might want a bit more flexibility in the negotiation phase so that you can walk away, either party if you need to. But the same element is there, same concept, gives you more flexibility. I would say that the BAFO, the best and final offer method, Okay, that's what we consider concurrent negotiation or dialogue type of procurement. That is used for more complicated, more complex procurements where it may not be as simple. So for instance, I've seen it used for business transformation type projects, could be heavily involved in IT, where things are very, very complicated, and getting in a room and talking about the proposal and the solicitation documents would be of great value. It's also because you tend to not know all of the answers about what you need. And so it does add that additional dialogue opportunity.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. So we have a couple questions from the chat. So this is about debriefs. So even if you are awarded a job or a contract or purchase order, can you still ask for a debrief?
Thank you, Nicole. So yes, you can. And while we focus a lot in telling our unsuccessful vendors to come in for a debrief or to request one, I think I actually prefer to also include that message to our successful proponents. So we shouldn't assume that, you know, if a minimum required score is 70, that, and I had a 76, that maybe I don't need a debrief, or maybe you know, I've just inched across. Maybe you're not aware of how well you've done, but you know that you've been successful. You should come in and talk to us. We want to talk to you about your proposal. And so maybe we can help you gain even more strength. You may be surprised as a successful proponent what you can learn. You may have forgotten some things, but you just scored higher than other proponents to inch across that highest rank line. So I really, really love it when I hear from successful proponents wanting to even advance more and improve.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yes, we don't know how we can improve. We don't ask the question. So even if you are successful, there's probably an opportunity for improvement at the next one. Next question we have from the chat. So this is a good question. So typically in an RFP, not necessarily from NBON, there seems to be generic terms and maybe specifics for an RFP. This is confusing as to what is really required. Is there a way to recap what is only required for the specific RFP?
Thank you, Nicole. That sounds like there's a very good story behind it, and I would love to hear the story on a different time and a personal chat. It sounds to me like if there are generic things being articulated and there's a lack of clarity, that you would benefit from proposing a question. So if you're reading something and you feel, nah, I've read this before and it's so generic, and maybe there's an interpretation to this differently in different RFPs, ask a question. I feel there's probably more behind that question that I could give a little bit more robust answer to, but I would just, again, reiterate that we do often use certain terminology, like for instance, company background, company references, and things like that. But if there's questions specifically under those umbrellas or the scope, you need to ask your question.
Super important information, Elizabeth. Ask, ask, ask. So we now have a follow-up question to that first question. So that was the question, Elizabeth, about those additional products on the tender. So we've got a clarification here. So I think this will help. So in an active tender, but what we are being asked for is not listed and is not an equivalent. So there's a company that has a tender for ABC products, but departments want to buy other products from them that are not in the tender.
Thank you, Nicole. I think that makes it even more clear. So during an open solicitation period, we will get questions from suppliers who are in essence asking us to almost pre-evaluate or pre-qualify a product that's not on there or that has been identified. I would say that you can still ask your question to us. It may allow us to review the requirements that we've put in place to be able to add that flexibility for the product. Or it may be as simple as, because of the technical need, the risk behind it, we are not in a position to be able to open it up just yet. But I would say that you shouldn't consider that all lost hope. I think that it's still important to engage with us and with the department in the future to see if there might be a potential to be able to consider that product in the future. Sometimes it just comes down to the level of time and risk that we have to consider transforming what we need for requirements and what we're willing to assume for risk. And the product could be fabulous, and it could actually be even stronger and better for us. It could simply just come down to the fact that we need a bit more time to be able to open ourselves up to that change. And so I do remind you, ask your question, raise the product, and see if we can do that. We often will say that we do not evaluate products until a tender closes, but it's still wise to ask your question in case there's something we failed to know or something that we could enhance in our tender document to include it.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Next question, I've got a few for you, so this is great. Keep them coming, folks. So this is about multi-stage evaluation method. Do you ever think that good vendors could be eliminated too early? If so, is there anything that could be done if the proponent thinks they had a good shot at winning the bid?
So do I think, could you repeat that?
Sure. In a multi-stage evaluation method, do you ever think that good vendors could be eliminated too early? If so, they must not be meeting one of those requirements. If so, is there anything that could be done if the proponent thinks they had a good shot at winning the bid?
So actually, Nicole, I can be quite clear in my answer with this. I think that of the vendors who are disqualified, and it could be multi-stage, it could be single stage with a minimum required score, of the ones who are unsuccessful, I think a lot of them are very good. I think it comes down to the fact that something was omitted from the story in their response. So something was forgotten, something was not explained clearly enough. It's a very personal situation when we do these debriefs, and we have to tell a vendor that it just didn't have enough detail in it, or it wasn't explained to answer the question. And so we have fabulous proponents who, for whatever reason, could be very busy, may have interpreted something in a certain way and didn't ask a question. And unfortunately, we probably know that some of these vendors can provide the service, but yet we have to evaluate based on what's in their response in alignment with the solicitation document. So actually, Nicole, I think that there are suppliers who are not just good, but very good. And it's difficult when those things happen, because it usually comes down to the fact that we just haven't seen the answer that needs to be there.
And again, Elizabeth, that's why it's so important to request those debriefs. If you did think you had a good shot at winning and you didn't win, or you weren't successful, ask the question why. Get that debrief to find out more and see how you can be more successful potentially next time. Another question about debriefs. This is a popular topic today, which is great. Should we ask for debriefs on FlexTrack contracts? And maybe explain what FlexTrack is?
Yes. So the first answer is yes. You should ask for a debrief always, in my opinion. My staff will say, great, because they're going to come in fast and furiously, but they're important, and we actually want you to request those debriefs. And so for FlexTrack, I'll explain a little bit. So FlexTrack is essentially a service that we have provided by a third-party managed service provider for contingent type labor. So, and it's often mostly around IT, business contingent labor resources. So it's people that we're bringing into government to provide specific type of services and specific type of tasks and deliverables that are not related to owning a complete project. It's more about a person, a resource coming in. We could be looking for a project manager. We could be looking for a senior systems analyst, a business analyst, change manager. So specific people as opposed to a team. And so I think some people feel that this particular type contract doesn't have a mechanism for debriefs, but we do debriefs, and we would welcome you to do that with FlexTrack. So if you didn't know that and you haven't participated in the past, please, by all means, do your debrief.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Next question, now we're shifting to food procurement. So in general, how would a food procurement RFP be structured? Would you use an A/B method, a BAFO method, or a rank and run?
So now I'm being tested on my creative juices. So it's interesting that you ask that. So a food type of RFP, I mean, it could be done as a tender, it could be done as an RFP. We typically would put an RFP out, whether it's for any type of good or service, with an opportunity to evaluate the actual product. So the food in itself, we could have an aspect in there that allows us to consider what type of dietary content would we like in the product that's being proposed. Is it a full fat type of cheese? Is it low fat? That sort of thing. But then more often than not, we'd also want to know about the provider of that production. So how is it being transported? How is it being maintained? How is it being, what are the sanitary conditions behind the company that's creating this product, as well as, of course, all of the corporate information. And so in terms of the flexible format versus the AB, I think, it really would depend on the type of food that we are procuring for and the nature of the market, how rigid or how flexible we could be in this. But I certainly think, I mean, if you were to ask me, I always think the sky's the limit in terms of the things that we can do with RFPs. So I hope I've answered your question, but I do think that there's a combination of product evaluation as well as company evaluation.
Great. Thanks for that too, Elizabeth. Next one. Okay, this might be testing your creative juices as well. What can smaller or newer companies do to compete against much larger or much more established firms on public procurement for service contracts? So as an example, when agencies put a percentage or size of the company into the tender, even though they end up only working with a handful of employees. So I'm assuming they mean that they're saying they have an X number of employees, even though there's only a handful working with actual government. So what can smaller or newer companies do to compete against much larger or more established firms on public procurement service contracts?
That's actually an awesome question. I would say to you this. So one thing is that it's more about the people you have in your company, not amount, the quality, the experience, than it is about the company itself. Now, there is a weight on the company, but one thing, and I'm so proud of this, that we do at Strategic Procurement, we encourage our clients to put less points on company background in terms of how many years have you been in business, how many people do you have employed. We put less focus on that. We put more focus, and often minimum requirements are imposed on the type of people you have on your team. So I would encourage, and if I were a vendor, I would encourage myself to do this. Focus on the resources that you're naming to projects. One of the things that we find happen with companies is they will put a resource team in place in order to be successful in the procurement, but then they'll want to substitute those resources later. And so we may not get the senior level experience that we really sought and evaluated and qualified you to get through the competitive round. So I would just challenge the smaller companies that first of all, don't see yourself as not as capable as the stronger companies. I see lots of small companies getting through. I would say, though, I would say this to larger companies and smaller companies alike. You need to focus on the quality that you're putting on the team who's doing the work. No matter what size company you have, it's about the people you name in your proposal who will actually deliver for government.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Next question. Who do we contact to ask questions on open tenders or once they are awarded?
Another good question. So basically, every tender that goes out has an issuing agent identified on the tender document. And so normally that's a category specialist or a senior category specialist, and they will be identified on the front page of the tender document. So for Part 1, 2 RFPs or tenders, there is always a blanket tender document that is posted, and on the very top of that, towards top or middle, there is a in the middle of the page there is an issuing contact name, and so you'll see in our case strategic procurement, and then under that the name of an individual. And so under that there's also a mechanism to submit questions, and there is actually a generic email address if you do have specific questions around procurement processes. So you can contact the specialist or you can contact strategic procurement directly if it's just a generic type procurement question.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. And for those who are wondering what that email address, NBON, okay, it's the NBON email address. NBON at, is it GNB? Oh my gosh,
yes.
I'm drawing a blank at the moment.
I think it's SNB.ca.
SNB? Okay, thank you. That'll be that's posted on most of our documentation, so you should be able to find that. And if you don't know, just put a note in the chat and we'll type that email in there for you. Next question. So I've run into issues when wanting to bid, but could not find a local installation company. So I've asked end users for a company they would prefer to deal with. The responses I have received are, we do not endorse a company. Do you have a list of available or approved companies?
Okay. So the response they received from the client is, we do not endorse
a specific company. Yes.
Yeah. And so I wouldn't be surprised that a client would tell you that, because they try very hard to stay independent from the procurement process. We actually tell them that we manage the process. It's intended to be open, fair, and transparent. And so what they've probably done is said that for a reason. And so what I would say is that we do not have an open list of those suppliers. And so, but we do encourage it often, right? We see it often that service providers are partnering with specific resellers of goods for installation or service. And so we would welcome you to submit your proposal. And it's important that if you have those questions, to ask them in advance. We may not be able to tell you while a tender is open if we can pre-qualify a supplier. That really sounds like it's something we do as part of the evaluation of the tender. But don't assume because a department told you or deferred you or deflected from that answer that you can't propose. It's often the case that they really prefer that strategic procurement handle the process, and that the evaluation of these service providers are done after the tender closes in adherence with the rules of the solicitation process.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Next question, and I can tell people are listening based on these questions. This is great. So, if telling the whole story is important, is an executive summary included in the response of an RFP given consideration? Also, sometimes value adds are included within the executive summary. Are these considered?
I love this question. So the executive summary, it's interesting. A lot of companies will put an executive summary. We don't often ask for this. We'll ask for company background, and that tends to dovetail into the same thing. But if we didn't ask for that section, there isn't a specific section that we put direct amount of weight on it. But I would say that if we put a requirement for, let's say, you to propose a methodology, and there was a specific criteria that we asked you to provide, and you didn't actually speak to that in your methodology section, but there was a paragraph, let's say, in your executive summary that actually spoke to it, we would consider the information that you provided in that section. While we really want it in the section that you're supposed to put it in, we are very fair in that if the content is somewhere in your proposal and we can find that content, then we will give you some consideration for that. I think we're extremely fair on that. Was there a second part to that question, Nicole?
About the value adds, Elizabeth.
Right. Value add. So value add's a hot topic that's in the industry right now. And so the I guess the thing about value add is that it's very, very diverse, and the sky is the limit around value add and the interpretation of what value add is. So in general, when government puts a value add section in an RFP, we're hoping to link it to a specific quantifiable opportunity or gain that is of no financial cost to us, but that is actually achieving some type of valuable gain to us. So sometimes proponents will name something that they deem value add, but it's not actually a value add for the province. And that again can be an awkward discussion. So basically value add, in our opinion, is where we've asked you to propose something that is of no additional cost to government, that does provide value to the province. And what I often recommend our clients to do is actually identify what areas, what types of value add might we suggest, just so that we can give our proponents a guide.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. That was a good answer. And this is the final question I have so far in the chat. So just a little reminder here, we have about 9 minutes left. So if you have any final questions for Elizabeth, please type those into the chat. So the next question I have, Elizabeth, and this is a good one too, they're all good questions. Can companies located outside of New Brunswick still compete for RFPs?
These are all really good questions. And I always find it so interesting to hear the types of questions that suppliers have, because I live in this world, so I assume everyone understands certain things, but this allows me to see what people actually do wonder about. Absolutely, if you live and work outside of New Brunswick and you have a product or service that you would like to provide, you certainly can bid on opportunities. We welcome anyone in the competitive market to submit their proposals. For under threshold procurements, we do have policies and abilities to give a preference to our local providers. However, for above threshold, we absolutely have full flexibility to accept proposals from outside of New Brunswick. And there are some commodities that New Brunswick suppliers just don't provide as well. So keep that in mind. A lot of people assume that while we do award in large part locally, there are some products and services that we can't find in New Brunswick. And so we still want those out of province proposals as well.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. So I'm just doing a final check here on our chat. And it looks like I think we've covered all the questions today. I'm going to ask one final question because I'm just curious, and it's one of my silly questions for you, Elizabeth. But what's your favorite type of RFP and why? You've used them all. What do you prefer to use?
So, Nicole, thank you for that question. And I can answer that quite quickly. Well, quickly, I guess, in terms of I can tell you which one, but I could talk forever on it. So the best and final offer procurement method, the BAFO, is my method of choice. And the reason it's my method of choice would be because of the innovation behind it. And so this particular method, along with the rank and run approach, are two methods that I am extremely proud to say that our staff at Strategic Procurement have introduced more commonly in the last 5 years, and now very readily used. And it tells me that we've transformed our culture at Service New Brunswick Strategic Procurement to think outside the box and to think of innovative ways to procure differently. And so there is a time and place for the A/B method, and you don't want to add time and complexity to a simple project, a simple need. But the best and final offer method excites me because I've seen so many business transformation projects be successful as a result of this new innovative method. So I hope that answers your question, Nicole.
Sure does. I was just very, very curious for my own personal knowledge, because we talk about RFPs all the time,
Yes.
obviously at strategic procurement. So, and they're new to us. So I was very curious of what you thought. So I do actually have one more question. So
Okay.
I kind of gave us a false ending here.
Sure.
Can we use subcontractors?
So the direct answer is yes. We do ask people to focus on the requirement in the tender document and read it thoroughly to make sure that we do allow it. But I would say that more often than not, the majority of the cases are, we actually welcome it. It allows our New Brunswick suppliers to stay competitive and get a piece of the business out there as well. So subcontractors allow oftentimes for larger companies to partner with a local firm to be able to deliver. We see subcontractors used a lot in buying products and then the warranty or service work. We see it a lot in business type transformation projects where you need numerous resources on a project. And so maybe the company that's bid as the primary doesn't have enough staff to be able to meet the demand. But if they partner with one or two other companies, they can more than achieve it. So just a reminder though, to make sure that you're reading your tender documents, because there's normally very explicit criteria and instructions around having to name your subcontractor and all of the details around that subcontractor. And often there is a clause in there that says we do reserve the right to approve or reject a third party subcontractor based on the requirements of the tender. So just a reminder on that.
Great. And a part two to that question.
Okay.
Would a subcontractor from New Brunswick be preferred?
So that's a hard question. Yeah. That's not a fair question. So my answer is I'm a New Brunswicker at heart. So I like to see New Brunswick companies be successful. And it's a valid question. So I think just as a follow-up to my comment from the last question, I believe that it gives an awesome opportunity for New Brunswick suppliers to partner with non-NB suppliers or other New Brunswick suppliers to be able to be considered. Depending on the dollar value of the procurement, preference is a very subjective word, right? So under threshold procurements, absolutely. Above threshold, we are not legally allowed to put a preference on the New Brunswick supplier. From a personal perspective, though, it's always very nice to see a New Brunswick supplier be able to be competitive and put themselves out there in those cases, in those larger opportunities above threshold. So yes, I like to see New Brunswick suppliers do well, but above certain thresholds, we have to follow the tender document.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Doing one final check of the chat. Think we are done with questions. So Elizabeth, thank you so much for this presentation. Again, like I said earlier, I love hearing you talk about RFPs. Makes me be a procurement geek too, hearing you talk about it. So thank you so much for this really informative session. And in case any of you are watching this here today and you thought, oh geez, my staff member should have attended this because this has been super informative, don't worry, it'll be posted tomorrow and you'll be able to see the presentation. There was also a lot of good information in that PowerPoint presentation, so we'll be sure to post that as well in PDF version. So our next presentation is not scheduled to begin until 2:45, where we'll hear from Opportunities New Brunswick. And actually, I think we've had a slight change in our program. We're going to be starting at 2:50 for that. So we'll see you all back at 2:50 for Opportunities New Brunswick. So for the next, 40-ish minutes, 45 minutes, take this opportunity to stretch, have a snack, grab a coffee, whatever you need, and enjoy the virtual trade show. So thank you so much. We'll see you soon.